Welcome to On Emergence podcast, a podcast on what it takes to be a human being. I'm Laura Sagen, your host and a fellow human being. Today, we're finishing up our three-part series on grief and sorrow, where I speak to Seagle on this very important subject. If you haven't checked out the other first two parts, feel free to do so at any time. You can watch this episode separately. You might lose a little bit of context, but I think you'll catch up. In this third part, we're going to cover the topics of 5 gates of grief. And I personally share my experience of a grief ritual which Zach has hosted here in Peru, Pisac, in the Sacred Valley of the Incas. I hope you enjoy this conversation, and I hope that you grow a little bit more curious about an uncomfortable subjects like grief and sorrow.
Okay, grief. I'm going to start with a little history. So in indigenous cultures, and many of them, there are regular grief rituals. It's just how you maintain a healthy, vibrant culture. It's through a ritual, and one ritual is through grief. And you just do it. It's not because you're in grief. It's not because you have a purpose for grief. It's just because grief is a human shared experience. And to maintain equilibrium, to maintain the frequency and the harmonics, really everything in this universe can be understood as music, which is really just math. To maintain the harmonics of a culture, you need to exercise and profess and get out of your body grief, so it doesn't stagnate in your body. Grief is a very heavy emotion. It's dense, and it's quite dark. Dark, again, doesn't mean bad or evil. Thank you, Christians. We did not need 2,000 years of labeling one bad and one good. It's kind of like cheeseburgers. Cheeseburgers are really dense and they're really fatty.
You just compare grief to cheeseburgers.
I did. If you eating one cheeseburger every once in a while is probably good for your soul. It's good for your spirit. You're like, great, I get to devour this cheeseburger. If you eat 3 cheeseburgers a day for years, you're gonna have cataratic issues. You're gonna have heart failure. Your veins are going to clog up. Your arteries are going to clog up. And you'll probably die of a heart attack at some point, right? It's going to have catastrophic impact on your body. One cheeseburger, great for the soul. Many cheeseburgers, not good for the body. Grief is like that. Grief is dark and it's dense. If you have too much grief in your body, you're weighing your body down. And it's going to get stuck in your system. It starts to coagulate. And it starts to slow down the natural process, the natural system of the body flushing things in and out. So indigenous cultures knew this. To maintain harmony within individuals and the collective, they regularly hosted grief rituals. Most of the grief rituals that we have in the Western world, or at least in California, but I think in the United States, is coming from one tradition. The tradition is coming from the Dagara people of Burkina Faso. And it was brought over by a couple, Malidoma and his wife Subanto Some. He has a fascinating story. In his book of Spirit of Water, he goes much more into depth. It's a really good book to read. Malidoma is stolen from his village. He grew up Dagara. His parents are Dagara. And he was stolen from his village, and he was put into a Jesuit or Catholic boarding school. This was a tactic in colonialization to rid the Indian out of the young by putting them in boarding schools. Malidoma went to a boarding school. He was so filled with grief, and grief stagnates to anger. It's covered up by anger. If you want to access our grief, go into your anger. His anger builds for more than a decade. He eventually throws a Jesuit priest out a window in a fit of rage. It's unclear if the priest dies or not, but the story, in my mind, he dies. And Malidoma flees and he runs. And he goes back to the Dagara people. And the Dagara people are like, what do we do with this guy? He's one of our own. He's Dagara. We remember him as a child here, but he's not initiated. He's an adult that has not been, he's in adult form, but he's still a child. He's not been initiated. So there's much debate amongst the elders if they're going to initiate him or not. And they eventually do. And they realize that there's a great deal of uncertainty about his safety. It could kill him. In fact, Malidoma goes out with other initiates, 10, and only 8 come back. And so initiation rites aren't safe, either in the Western context or in the indigenous context. But Malidoma, his name means like the one who speaks to the enemies or teaches the enemies. And in Dagara tradition, your name is part of your mythopoetic identity. It's like built already into the system. It's so cool.
It's very convenient.
So convenient. So Malidoma eventually, because he has this Jesuit experience in education, he can speak perfect English and French, and he knows Dagara, and he knows traditions, he's been initiated. And so he's the perfect person to be an emissary from the Dagara people to the colonial powers. So he moves to California, and he works with a psychologist, Francis Weller, who wrote another beautiful book, The Wild Edges of Sorrow. And they were informed in part with a collaboration with Martine Prechtel, who's an indigenous elder and healer in the Tutsahila Maya tradition of Guatemala, around Santiago, a place on Lake Atilan. And Francis Weller and Malidoma, they really take this Dagara grief ritual, but they take the values of these indigenous wisdom rituals, not the rituals themselves, and they adopt the values in a unique Western ritual. And that was the ritual you experienced last week. It is, the values system is from the Dagara. However, the rituals are uniquely Western. This is a way, I think, relating to that cultural appropriation topic that we talked about. And in the work of Francis Weller, he really describes that like grief is not meant to be just held by the individual. It's not just your grief. Again, coming from a Western context where we're trying to individualize everything. Everything is mine. I can consume something. I can own it. It's my grief. It's my process. In the indigenous way of understanding, it's just grief. Grief is just like the water. It flows naturally through a valley. Just let it flow. You don't have to own it. We, our minds, try to make meaning of it. You feel grief, you're like, why am I sad? What do I have to be sad about? Is it my job? Is it my partner? Is it my kids? Is it my friends? Is it my lack of? Is it this thing? Our minds try to make meaning of it because it's trying to own it. Rather, just experiencing it as grief. It's just grief going through the system. It doesn't have to be your grief. And it doesn't have to have any meaning. Sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. Weller talks about 5 gates of grief. And these gates open to the communal hall of sorrow. That there is a place in consciousness that is just where sorrow is. It's just the place of the waters. It's the place of sorrow. And these gates help us access this grief. The first one is like everything that we love, we will lose. This is like our personal loss. We know this through the death of family members and loved ones, through relationships that end, that jobs that we get fired from or have to quit suddenly, the death of a pet. So everything that we love, we will lose, is one way that we enter into the communal hall of sorrow. The second gate of grief is the places that we that have not known love. The places in our psyche, the parts of us that we've rejected and placed in the shadow and relegated. Jung is the one that, like, I think coins this term, the shadow. This idea that sort of they're in a form of psychology called internal family systems theory. This idea that our ego structure is not a unified whole. It's actually made up of various parts. And these parts carry burdens. We would know some of these parts. Some of these parts are like, don't eat the donut. It's the one in your head that's like, you're going to get fat if you keep eating the donut. You don't want to get fat because you're not going to fit into the suit. And then the other, another part of us is like, eat the donut. It feels so good. We haven't had a donut in weeks. You deserve the donut, right? And you see how these parts are now a little bit of a tug of war. The inner taskmaster that's like, don't forget the bread. She's going to yell at you if you forget the bread. Oh, we're out of toilet paper. You need to go get toilet paper. Oh, there's a project that's happening next Thursday. Don't forget it. Like, it's the person it's the part of us that's always the taskmaster. The self-critic. We all have many of these parts, right? The addict. Jung understood these parts to be archetypal, but these are individual parts of our psyche. And some of them are fragmented, and some of them are split, and some of them are at war with each other. And there's a relationship that we can build from our core essence with each one of these. In most of us, we have fragmented parts that we relegated to the shadow. It's the parts of ourselves that we reject. I am not a jealous person. I'm not. I have no jealousy in me. My identity is so fixated on me not being jealous that my jealousy, because it's a human emotion, is relegated to the shadow. And what's repressed in the shadow doesn't just stay there quietly. It becomes ferocious, and it lashes out in unexpected ways and very unconscious ways. So part of the grief that we experience, there's this grief in our body that's not connected to anything that we're even consciously aware of, is all these subconscious personalities that we have relegated to the shadow and don't show them any love. And they're carrying grief in our system. The third gate of grief is the sorrows of the world. Because we're sensory animals, smell, taste, touch, feel, our skin is like this subtle layer of perception that we interact with the world. We can pick up, even if we don't consciously aware of it, we're feeling that the biosphere is dying, that the world is heating up, that our civilizations are fraying, that politics is corrupt, that our societies are filled with death, drug abuse, fentanyl crisis, opioid crisis, depression and suicide, the loss of the biosphere. I remember the Deep Horizon spill, where there was just plumes of oil, tens and thousands of gallons, spewing into our ecosystem, destroying the coral, killing the fish. We're all connected. We can all feel that. Our senses are often dulled, so we can't consciously become aware of it, but our bodies still register that knowledge. And so there's grief of the sorrow of the world. The fourth gate, I'm not quoting it quite exactly, but it's this concept of like everything that we expected but did not receive is another form of grief. So another access to the communal hall of sorrow, the death of dreams. Everything that we say yes to means that we say no to something else. Every relationship we commit to, we close the door on another. Every job we take, we say no to another. Every step has both yes and no. And the no's don't just go away. They need to be mourned so that dream can be fully felt, expressed, and move out of the system. Otherwise, it stays with us. Another big part of this, the things that we expected that we did not receive, are things like all of us expected to have healthy families, emotionally secure, that were psychologically safe, or we were nourished. And many of us did not receive that. It's not laying blame on our parents. They didn't receive that either. Our cultures have been out of whack for a while. Many of us had a dream of being a husband or a wife and are unmarried now. Like me, I've always dreamed of having a family. I wanted 5 kids. I could still maybe have 5 kids. I'm only 35. But there's a part of me that needs to mourn. There was a dream I've had of like being a young father, right? Of having kids in my 20s so I would have lots of energy. That dream is dying. It doesn't mean that another dream can't be possible, but you have to give space for the parts of us, the things that we expected in life that we haven't received. Healthy families, a working culture that's great, right? Our working cultures suck for the most part. A big mourning for me was schools. Loved the idea of being a teacher. It was so fucking hard. I was a teacher for 10 years. It's brutal. These people are treated horribly. To be a shitty teacher, I calculated this when I was working in an educational project with Stanford. To be a shitty teacher, to just do the job, which means in the world of education, if you just show up and do the job, you're a shitty teacher. You're labeled with things like you don't love kids, you're not in it for the team, you're not part of the team and family, yada, yada, yada. In order to just be a mediocre teacher, just do the job, you have to work 56 hours a week. That's a lot.
That's a lot.
To be a good teacher, you have to work like 70 hours a week. It's nuts. And you burn out. Everyone's burning out, or a lot of teachers are burning out. That was a dream. I had a dream that schools could be beautiful. Instead, the first school I worked in, there were tear gas canisters that were rolled down the hallways to move students from class to class. There were 400-person fights every day in the classroom. Teachers' cars were being firebombed outside with gasoline and Molotov cocktails. These were unsafe. We're not even talking about like unimaginative. They were just like war zones. I worked in Palestine and I saw worse shit in Memphis, Tennessee than I saw in Ramallah or in Hebron back in 2010. I've traveled to Sudan. I've seen places. I've seen fucked up war zones. And they're right here in the United States, in our schools. That's a loss of a dream. That's a deep mourning that I've spent years mourning and still comes back up. And the last gate of grief is ancestral grief. The grief that, unlike what most Westerners want to believe, again, this is just my personal opinion, that I think a lot of wisdom traditions teach, you are responsible for the sins of your parents. What goes unhealed in previous generations, responsible for healing. We carry the wounds of our ancestors. This is well documented in a great book called In the Realm of Hungry Ghost by Gabor Mate. He's a physician and an addiction specialist, and he studies addiction from a neurological, chemical, and much more like material worldview. And he traces ancestral trauma and generational trauma and historical trauma of how it imprints into the next generation. He's measured that, like, when mothers who might have a ton of anxiety are breastfeeding, the hormone of cortisol is released through breast milk. And so the babies are being fed off of a neurological chemical of cortisol that releases anxiety. That's how we experience anxiety neurochemically. And this can be traced in other maladaptive ways of being too. And whole cultures. There's another really good book by Thomas Hubel called Collective Trauma, or Healing the Collective Trauma, which he studies in Jewish descendants of the Holocaust, of how that trauma appears 3 or 4 generations later in the children who had not been through the trauma but are still carrying the wounds of that trauma. So the last gate of grief is our ancestral grief, the grief we carry from our ancestors. What hasn't been healed is still required to be healed. And healing doesn't mean sick, it means wholeness. We have to make those traumas whole again. Part of it is by feeling the full expression of those emotions. And one of those emotions is grief. In grief rituals, it is designed to move grief collectively. Ritual inherently is theatrical. You're taking these subconscious, psychological phenomenon and you're embodying it into theatrical ritual. This is why the gods of theater are also often the gods of ritual, like Dionysus. Dionysus, Bacchus, governs both ritual and theater because there's an intimate connection between enacting. In our grief rituals in the United States, we try to dress it up. We have a party where you have a little handkerchief here and to dab your face with. Not too much crying, but you want to cry just enough so it looks okay. Dress it up in a suit. In the African traditions that I have witnessed grief rituals in, it's rolling, it's crying, it's scratching at the earth, it's visceral, it's animal, and it gets all that emotion out of the body. Our ancestors, was well documented. This is what the biblical tradition talks about. In the Lamentations, in the book that most Christians don't read, is the best parts of the Old Testament. Lamentations is one of them, and in it the prophets are ripping their sackcloth and pouring ashes on their face and processional through the village over collective trauma. The prophets angry and grief-stricken of how the needy are being sold for a pair of sandals, as Amos puts it. And so you have prophets who are collectively embodying the grief and trauma of the collective, and they're ritually enacting it in the streets through processions. And in ancient cultures and indigenous cultures today, there was space made for this to happen because it's not economically productive. Give 3 bereavement days, and after 3 days, if it's an extended family, you get 5 days to grieve. If it's an immediate family, you're expected to go back to work, and that means you need to be functional. And so don't show too much emotion, and don't be your wild self. Your wild self is emotional. We have relegated the emotions.
I think we try to, but we failed because it's not possible to contain it in that, because it's going to show up years later in some sort of disease, in some sort of therapy chair, saying that would take years to actually dig deep enough. It's like, oh, that's the unprocessed grief. That is that piece that now I need to do it, and now my life is going to feel like it's falling apart. Whereas actually that is the moment where it is actually coming together.
Yeah, it's the falling apart where things come together. Ritual is asking us to become disarranged, to become dismembered, to fall apart, to break open, so that we can be open. The broken heart is an open heart.
I was certainly felt a lot of wild edges of the grief, and shards that would be pieces of my grief right in this very room. And I am still processing it. It's been a while, 10 days. What is 10 days? Yeah, I think my wish is that this type of grief rituals would be more well spread in the Western civilization. I just had 2 friends who recently lost their parents. So 2 separate friends. One lost her mother, who's actually coming to visit me here in Pisac, and another one lost her father, like very sudden. To me, when it happened, my reaction to grief probably would have been different if I didn't lose my father earlier. It was more like, oh, I know how it feels, and I'm here for it. I'm just gonna call you. You don't have to pick up. Whatever it is, it's all welcome. I really hope that, I don't know, I'm curious if there's a way to set this up, the grief rituals, in more places.
Yeah, well, where were some of the...
that you also do, or... Because I know you hosted it here in Pisac, but I think it also requires a physical presence as well.
It does, yeah. Yeah, I'm curious of what you made of the grief ritual so far. Some of the parts that stood out to you, that were most impactful for you. Parts maybe that you were like, oh, I wish a person could experience this piece.
I don't know if that is going to be included on podcast or not. Maybe. I don't know that yet. For me, it was okay, I'm going to throw different things on the table. I was really aware when we had the separation of the space of the kind of like the other world where the altars were. And I was just very acutely aware when we were dancing on one side before crossing the threshold and chanting, not just dancing or just like letting our bodies move. I was very aware that space is different in percept. Like I could sense the spirits were dancing there. Like the ancestors were there. Like it was that, and then it's their space. So that was something that stood out for me. One of the things that I was surprised. I surprised myself that I first went to compassion, and I developed compassion to myself. Like I realized the path that I've walked to date, and I was like, oh wow, this woman who lost her father quite young. I think, as my therapist said, there is like a club for people who lose a parent before they hit 30. It was like a week before I turned 30 that he passed away. And I was like, I just had this compassion to myself, who kind of tried to figure out the way without real elders in her life, because all my grandparents passed away like a while ago. And I'm just like, I'm just figuring it out. And I'm here in this room with other people. There's someone wailing. And I was like, but this is me figuring figuring out how to be an adult in the life that I don't have the adults that I needed. And then another point is when I went to the Ancestral altar. And there was a piece that I discussed with my therapist. And it's about freedom, because one of my absolute core values is freedom. She asked me, she's like, well, have any of your ancestors experienced freedom? Like, is it something that is familiar to you from the lineage? And I thought about it, and I was like, and I realized that no, because there was always, especially in the kind of female lineage, is like there is a constant dependency on the male. And as well as fear of the masculine. There is a fear of your freedom and beliefs and values being taken away that happened at least twice, and that affected both sets of my lineages. So when the revolution happened, so Red Revolution, and my mom's side was on the red side and my dad's side was on the white side. So it was like the effect was vastly different, and I'm carrying them all. So that whole value system of the empire and the Kazakhstan, the way that it was broken down completely. And some of my ancestors, they had to flee and create a different identity and then reinvent themselves. And then there comes my grandfather generation when he had to adjust and not at that point, it was already Soviet Union started picking up. Then the Second World War happened, that Soviet Union, Kazakhstan was part of Soviet Union at that time. Like that, there was also Stalin's famine. It's all carried in me. And then more recent history is my parents. It's even though it didn't happen when I was already I was born in 1989, so Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. I actually was also my parents' generation and myself feeling the reverberations of that a Soviet empire collapsing, and that all this value system that have collapsed, and it's like there was no free. What is freedom? Like
exactly. Yeah.
How and then I don't know anything beyond my great grandparents, some of them. But when I was sitting in front of the ancestor at the altar, I was like, I told them, I was like, I'm doing this. I'm doing this for you because you get to live freedom. Once I embody it, as I embody it, you get to live through it. You get to live the life that you didn't get to. And I will show you, and I need your support. Sometimes I need your support to kind of lift me up in that experience. And it was and I spent quite some time in front of the ancestral altar. And then before going to the grief altar, you served me rape. I asked to and I always say that, I tend to say, and I recognize it, that rape is not my medicine in terms of, it's not something that I'm particularly comfortable. It's unknown. I treat it with respect, but it's not something that I feel like, that it's like with psychedelic mushrooms, for example. It's like they are my teachers. I was very comfortable in that space. With the rape, and then that took me places, and that took me right to the grief altar. And what it came, and like I mentioned to you in the voice note before, I was grieving two things. I was grieving my father, and I was grieving a dream of a relationship that never has. And the dream that I had, which sometimes I would even say is even more difficult. Mm-hmm. I get to compare the relationship that was with my father and relationship that never has. At least there are memories, at least there's something to grieve.
And part of that is too, like in our cultures, we give permission to one without the other. Like our cultures unconsciously tell us, no, you shouldn't feel grief or sadness about this thing that never happened. But like your father is permissible. That makes sense. And so like in culture, with these 5 gates, we only open one of them, and there's 4 that are left closed to us. And so I think it's really beautiful that like, of you speaking something that's really powerful is like, in some ways, it might be harder for us to grieve something that we might not get culturally permitted to grieve, like the dream of a relationship that never happened, unrequited love, right? No one gives you bereavement time off at work for breaking up or getting rejected by a lover that you have been pursuing for years and had built this whole dream around, but they do if you were married, right? So there's like legitimate grief in our culture and illegitimate grief. And in grief ritual, we're trying to invite all of it so they have expression. So I think it's really beautiful that you could access that gate of grief too.
It was another realization that I had when and it was one of the beautiful pieces of the grief ritual is that someone holds you. Mm-hmm. And I put in my feedback form. At first I was like skeptical. I don't need to be held in front of it. But then when I was right there in front of it, I was like, wow, it's so, I knew that I didn't know who that was, but that someone is there to catch me. And then I had this sensation. It's not vision, it's not sensation, but you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. What happened after my father passed away, it's actually They happened about a month and a half after a breakup from a relationship that was very, very, very dear to my heart. Then he passed away, and it was like this compounded grief that happened. And I didn't exactly know how to navigate that space, apart from just, I turned 30 2 weeks after his passing. And I organized a big event in the big countryside where I invited a bunch of my friends from all over the world. And I was like, do I still want to do it? And now so I was like, yes, I want to be surrounded by loved ones. Mm-hmm. But what happened, and it was a beautiful celebration. It was a celebration of my life, of my father's life. But what happened afterwards is that I collapsed. There were days where I wouldn't, when I got out of bed, I was like, well done, Laura, you got out of bed. Yeah. I would take a shower, and some days I was like, well done, you took a shower. I had the luxury to do that. I was like in between. I was actually just finished a contract as a freelancer. So I had the luxury of just having that little bit of resting time. But I also was working on what then, I didn't know that at the time, but I was working towards it, what would then become the company, the Hair Fuel, my other company. And what I found the biggest solace in is working on it. So all that grief from my father and the breakup that happened back then, I just threw it all into work. Yeah. And it was in front of this altar, like around this literally this space. And I realized that was my offering. Mm. The company that I've built, and now it's going through a period of transition because I'm questioning. I know that this is not what I'm not. I know there were certain realization came that it's not something I want to continue doing. I realized that was an offering. Yeah. Like that the company that I've built and that helped many people along the way. And I also have this distinct feeling, it's like that's not where my soul lies anymore. It's like I gave it my all. I'm proud of what I did. It didn't turn out, and there was some grieving that needs to happen as well. It didn't turn out the way that I really wished it for. And also the relationship that didn't happen was also part of that grief too, because there are certain unresolvedness. When your parent passes away, when you're younger, you don't get to experience them as an adult. You don't see them that they're just as fallible human being as you are. You still hold them in a pedestal. And that's what I've been going through in the last 5 years, is kind of like taking him down from the pedestal and realizing he was a human being. Because my relationship with my father impacted how my relationship with men. And that is that relationship that never happened, that got impacted by that without me really realizing it. I think Monday or Tuesday, a couple of days later, I did get some offering, and then I sat with my ancestors again in front of my own altar. And just yesterday, I was journaling. I was like, I'm feeling weird. I was like, what is it? And I was just writing. I was like, feed the ancestors. It's like, okay, here's some beans, here's some rice, here's some flowers, sit with them. And I felt better.
It's a beautiful expression to see what ritual can invite in and through us. Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. It was a really big honor to see your process in ceremony. All of us showed up really well that night. It was a beautiful evening of real human expression, and that was all welcomed. Yeah, so thank you for showing up.
Thank you. I forgot to mention that I don't know if it's going to go live, but just in case it does go on a podcast, I did throw up a lot. Mm-hmm. And I think it was the way that it never happened to me. The way it's just and I think there's something that was coming out as there is, because that was after the grief altar. It was at some point between grief altar and then the bathroom and then lying down, and you just need to, again, physical manifestation of grief sometimes involves purging.
Totally. And in the Amazonian traditions, the ayahuasca the vine is used as a purgative. We were not working with drinking ayahuasca, but that whole day I was calling in and invoking and inviting the spirit of ayahuasca to be present in our ritual. And so in many ways, I've never actually been part of a grief ritual or anyone purged. But the fact that all of us in that room that night, all 12 of us, had drank ayahuasca at some point in our lives, and I have a strong relationship with that spirit, and I was specifically calling that energy in. It was really interesting that 4 people purged, and so I thought that was really a beautiful expression, which again, like, people can write off as coincidence, but it's been, to me, a very verifiable observation that I've noticed in other ceremonies that I've held, where I'm not serving medicine, because I don't serve ayahuasca, but I have a strong relationship with it, and I do invoke it, her into the space, and people purge in ways that I have.
Zach, I think this is a very open ending to our conversation, because I am excited to hear how your projects are going to blossom, and I hope to have you back again. And whether it's going to be in Pisac or wherever it is going to be in the world. But I just want to thank you for your time today, and for your time in that you've held space for 12 people. It was very impactful. And I was really glad that actually I was part of it, because I was debating whether to participate or not at this last moment. That I had the luck to experience that. Thank you for that.
Well, I felt lucky having so many beautiful people in the container, including you, and the way you showed up. That's what makes the ritual powerful, is how each of us show up. So thank you. And thank you for inviting me to do an interview. This was really fun. And sorry, I'm kind of like a book where I just like...
That's okay. It's perfect.
Less interview, less like dialogue than that.
So just once more, where do people, if they want to get involved, if they have more questions about grief, if you're open to it at all, if they can get in touch with you, or you like all the information on the website, how is there any way if someone feels called to, I'll maybe send their children to the forest school here in Pisac? How do they get in touch?
Yeah, both ways, grief or education. agoraacademy.org, or just my email, Seagle, last name, Seagle, Zachary, Zachary, @gmail.com. Agora is mostly around education and soul development, and wilderness expedition and immersion. The grief work is a new venture. I'm not entirely sure how to like seamlessly weave it into education, but I think it's coming. I'm excited about an upcoming death doula training that I'm going to do too.
Oh, we haven't talked about death. There's going to have to be another episode.
So that's it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. I hope you enjoyed this 3-part series on grief and sorrow with Zach Seagle, talking about this very important yet somehow dark subject. If this episode resonated with you, I invite you to forward it to someone that you think might benefit from this conversation. I invite you to subscribe to the channel On Emergence on YouTube and follow on Instagram. I'm excited to continue the conversation on what it takes to be a human being, and I will speak to you next week.